I don't know if any of you listened to Women's Hour yesterday, but Jamie Oliver was getting a hard time from Jane Garvey for his comments about big TVs and cheese and chips out of styrofoam trays. But it was when she said that he was effectively giving women a hard time that it chimed with what Pete's just said. And he was absolutely horrified that his comments about producing good meals and home-cooked food should somehow be seen as a gender issue. I think some of us might not be quite so shocked that it might be seen that way. Anyway, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Katherine Trebeck. She's Policy and Advocacy Manager for Oxfam's UK programme. Prior to this role, she was Research and Policy Officer for Oxfam Scotland. I happen to know Oxfam quite well. I used to work for them, and she achieved a bit of a coup, I would say, by arguing that her new role in the UK programme should be carried out from Scotland, even though it's a UK-wide job, which Oxfam, being very progressive, isn't necessarily as progressive as we would all like. She's done a cracking job on that. She developed Oxfam's Humankind Index, which is a measure of Scotland's real prosperity, produced through widespread community consultation, and was kind enough to invite me onto the steering committee for that, so I know a bit about it. It was a really fascinating project with some really interesting outcomes. She's part of the Scottish Council for Voluntary Organisations Policy Committee and on the board of Energy Action Scotland and the board of the Ethical Network. I'd also add she's a thoroughly enjoyable person to listen to and to be with. So over to Katherine.
Just bear with me for a minute while I try and show. Okay. Do you know, this must be one of the most important conferences happening this year, because we're living in a world where a third of the population suffers from malnutrition, so active malnutrition, and another third go to bed feeling hungry every day. And yet this is the world where there's more than enough food to go around, way more than enough. And we've seen figures where between 30 to 50% of our food is wasted. And so that tells you very starkly there's something very, very wrong with our food system. So I'm really excited to be invited to be here to talk to you. I'm much more excited about what you're going to come up with to sort out our broken food system. What I want to talk about is, here we go, magic allow button, is the broken economy. Oxfam a couple of months ago now, published a report called Our Economy, and it's all about taking the economy back so that it very much serves the people rather than serves the economy itself and serves profit. So I'd urge you to have a look at that. It's online. I've got a couple of copies, and it's being debated in the Scottish Parliament tomorrow afternoon, so keep an eye out for that. What we know is that our economy here in the UK is broken. Deeply, deeply broken. It's been broken for a long time, actually, because it hadn't been reducing poverty sufficiently, despite it growing, and it certainly hadn't been reducing health inequalities. What we've had, though, is most recently these massive bailouts of the banks, where we've had about £1.5 trillion going into bailing out our banks. And at its most stark, what that has been really is socialisation of the risks taken by the very few in our society, the risks taken by the very, very wealthy. And it's come at the cost very much to the rest of us. And so what we're now seeing as a repercussion for that is money being taken back from our important public services, our collective institutions, those really precious institutions that bind us together as a society. They enable us to have dignity in the face of misfortune. And we're seeing rises in long-term unemployment, we're seeing declining support for the vulnerable, and we're now in a situation where now this will be the first generation leaving schools now who will be worse off than their parents. And all these funding cuts are very much hitting the poorest, the hardest, the groups that Oxfam works with. So you see here that the poorest tenth of the population, in terms of the income that they're losing due to the spending cuts as a result of the bailout of the banks, of the very wealthy, is about a third of their income. a fifth of their income compared to 1.5% of the richest income. So there's a huge imbalance. And so perhaps it's not surprising that we're seeing these expansion of health inequalities and expansion of inequalities in life expectancy. So in Glasgow, where I'm from, a distance of just 8 train stops, this is from Jerry McCartney from the NHS, a distance of just 8 train stops that you go from west to east in Glasgow could mean a gap of 13 years in life expectancy. I mean, that's just staggering in the 7th richest country in the world, and we let this go on. And what you could do is hazard a guess that as people's anxiety increases in the next few years, as they're no longer qualifying for benefits that they used to rely on, they're not unable to get a job that will enable them to lift themselves out of poverty, you can hazard a pretty valid guess, I think, that those gaps are going to grow. And that already what Oxfam's hearing about is increased suicide in the communities where we work, as people are just giving up hope, and they're being put under so much stress from the changes in the welfare system and the lack of decent jobs that they can hang on to and build a life of dignity. And what we're just seeing is these communities completely ravaged by the cuts. And so it's unsurprising we're really talking about a broken economy and a broken welfare system. And all that economy really is offering, when you hear about green shoots and so on, what those green shoots are: 0-hour contracts, agency work, self-employment. Now, self-employment's fine if you're a high-skilled graphic artist consulting to a firm. But if you're a 55-year-old woman who used to be a member of a cleaning team who now has to go self-employed, and you're lucky to get 3 hours a week, self-employment is a pretty toxic situation. And so we're starting to talk about our broken economy more and more, and it's resonating with people. And so what we see that's probably most relevant to you today is this broken economy is very much played out in what I'm calling our food lives, in that the poorest particularly are cutting back because, one, they can't afford the food, and the food's just not available. So take that, Jamie Oliver. And what they're doing is they're rationing themselves. So one of the community members that we work with tells of how pensioners are walking for hours on end, literally, to find the cheapest bag of potatoes. And he said, after the war, they received rations, and now what they're doing is rationing themselves because they cannot afford to buy food to keep them nourished. And so we're now at a situation where the Food Ethics Council estimates that 4 million people in the UK are in food poverty, and something that Oxfam reported out about at the end of May with, sorry, that's such a dodgy image there. You can get this report online. It's called Walking the Breadline, and it's a report we published with Church Action on Poverty at the end of May, where we estimated very, very conservatively that over 500,000 people are turning to food banks in the 7th richest country in the world. And let me tell you, that is such a conservative estimate. 500,000 people turning to food banks. Just staggering. And so people are being denied dignity, they're being denied life chances, they're being denied health, and as we see in the great gaping health inequalities, they're actually being denied life itself. So that's what's going on here, pretty grim, pretty stark. It's not much better around the world, I'm afraid. And so in the global picture is something where we see that the economy is also in the frame for the broken food system. Let me tell you what's happened in the last decade or so. So very, very recently, food itself, our most precious life-sustaining food, is becoming just another commodity. It's being traded on the financial markets as any other commodity would be. And it's reached, as you can see in that graph, it's reached really a point of frenzy. So let me give you just one statistic about this. As recently as 1996, speculation on the food futures market accounted for just 12% of that market. 1996, just 12%. In 2011, 61% of the food futures market was speculative trade. And what that is, it's callous gambling. Literally, it's callous gambling on life-sustaining commodities. And it's just not acceptable. And what happens is that the speculation pushes up the prices of food and pushes people into poverty. And a lot of commentators have said that the tension and the stress and the way that pushes people to breaking point is in some part behind some of the uprisings that we saw in the Arab Spring. And so when you think about that, all these rising food prices in numbers of people around the world, what we see is that the poorest people who suffer, because one, they spend most of their income on food, so that if the food price is going up, that's going to squeeze what little else they had. And that's enforcing changes to their diets. What they're doing is then selling those productive assets that they might have had, say their cattle, for example, that would enable them to have an income the next year. They're selling those just to get by on a week-to-week basis. They're going into debt, again, just to be able to afford some rice. They're taking their kids out of school. They're marrying earlier than they would have otherwise done. And we're also hearing about increased risk of domestic violence, children at risk of stunting because of the impact on this, impaired cognitive development, and people migrating in search of food. And so they're leaving those social networks that are so important for their survival. And so the human impact of rising food prices is profound, but it's also very, very long-lasting. You know, when they're taking kids out of school, they're selling their productive assets, we're talking about, even if food prices were to come down tomorrow, we're talking an impact that's going to be around for some time. And it's so profound that we have the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food, when he's talking about the rise of food prices and the rise of speculation in the financial markets, speculation on food, he says this is a silent mass murder entirely due to man-made actions. So it's no wonder we're talking about the broken economy. So that leaves us with where do we go from now? What can we do? And I guess the option is, you know, that most of our political parties are talking about is just recovery. Go back to business as usual. Recover that old economic model. And can you read that? Not very well. This little bubble says, "I'm going mad. I need some space. I need some sky and some fresh air." And the response is, "Don't worry, darling. One day we'll get out of this madness and be free. We'll go up and live on the 92nd story." And to me, that epitomizes this sort of business as usual response, where it's everyone scrambling to get to the top of that pretty toxic and pretty unhealthy pile and keeping those beneath them in their place. You know, getting to the 92nd floor is not good enough. What we want to do is create a city that actually everyone's fine, not just those on the 92nd floor. And so what I think we need to start doing is celebrating and scaling across those solutions that already are around us. And what I'm really excited about is that Nourish started after meetings with people and community groups, and it identified this common purpose. And it has this goal of reshaping the food system so that it's fair, affordable, and sustainable. And do you know what, though? That's not a scary leap into the unknown. It might be huge change, but the vision is already there. There's already examples of that sort of vision, the sort of future that Nourish is talking about, in pockets around the world and also in the communities that we work with here in Scotland. And so let me give you a few examples of those. So one of Nourish's aims is that diversity of a thriving small food businesses. This one is in Liberia. It's a women's cooperative that Oxfam started, and what we did is purchase the land for the women. There's about 1,000 women members now. They're growing their vegetables. They can sell them in Monrovia. They've built their resilience. They're able to invest, which gives them security of income. Most of their families now have been able to send their children to school for the first time because of the income they've earned through working this food cooperative. And one thing that's really important is that women's involvement in decision-making in the families and in the communities has risen as well. It's a really, really exciting example. Bringing it closer to home, another one of Nourish's aims is that people from all walks of life are empowered to make better food choices. Now, this is one of Oxfam's partners at Sunnygovern Radio in Glasgow, really fantastic, edgy community radio station. If you're in Glasgow, 103.5 FM, they're brilliant. And what they do is they speak truth to power, they support the local community that's been through a hell of a lot of turmoil. They increase people's incomes, they develop local gardens, and essentially they help people take back control. And again, that's an example of starting to deliver on those Nourish aims. Another aim that Nourish has is everyone being able to afford to feed themselves and their family well. What we see in Clydebank is the establishment of a food bank, but not a typical food bank. It's a food bank that's all about fighting back. And what they've done, what the community in Clydebank outside Glasgow has recognised, they've recognised the broken economy, they've recognised this broken social safety net, they've recognised that that's a reality, and what they're going to try and do is fight back. So yes, they're doing short-term food provision, but their eyes are very much on the prize of changing the system. So it's doing much more than just handing out cans of baked beans. Another of Nourish's aims is a stronger food culture, which is bringing people closer together. This is an example of a community garden in Denniston in Glasgow called the Denniston Diggers. And it's shared garden space, places for eating and talking. They've got seats, all sorts of people are growing vegetables there. It's running over the vegetables and flowers that are growing there. And what they do, they're very conscious of talking and learning and being inclusive. And it's actually located in the back garden of a sheltered housing accommodation that they've given this space over to the Denniston Diggers. And so they're sharing the food with the vulnerable women who have had to turn to the sheltered housing. And it's all about teaching and learning. So it's a really exciting example of Nourish's aim of bringing people closer together, but using food as a hook to do that. This is the Humankind Index that Sheila mentioned. Nourish's final aim is that wherever you go in Scotland, you can find healthy, local, seasonal, organic food. Now, what we did with the Humankind Index is talk to people about what's important to them in terms of their prosperity, what they need to live well in their community. And then we mapped how well different communities are doing against those aims and those priorities. And what it very much does is highlight that access to the gaps between access to services in deprived communities and non-deprived communities. And it highlights also the chasms in health and access to nutritional food. And so what it's doing is trying to put those gaps at the forefront of policy making. So again, another example of something that's out there and happening already to try and address Nourish's aims. And I'm going to leave you with this, my favourite cartoon in the world, to help guide your discussion over the next few days, to say it's really about growing what we've already got, those wonderful little examples in pockets in communities, supporting them and celebrating them, but scaling them across so that they become the system rather than this toxic, broken system that we're already fighting up against. Thank you.
Fascinating. Okay, we've got two more witnesses this morning. If any of you are clock watchers and are worried that we're not keeping to time, don't worry. Very sadly, we lost one of our witnesses from this morning's session, Michael Northcote. So we now have two more speakers rather than the three listed in the programme. These two come from the Poverty for Truth Commission, which is an initiative that emerged from Faith and Community Scotland, which is working through faith communities to combat poverty. The Poverty for Truth Commission was formed in March 2009 out of a session where a group of people from disadvantaged communities actually testified on their experiences of poverty in front of 400 people in Glasgow City Chambers. The really important thing about this initiative is really this message that we can't address poverty without working alongside those who are affected by it. Nobody really knows the solutions without talking to people who really understand the issues in their own lives. I certainly believe that. So our first speaker is David Milligan, a social worker who's worked in social care and social work for 25 years until 2010 and was a chairperson of the anti-poverty organisation Glasgow Brendan Link from 2001-2004. He's been a volunteer with Faith in the Community since 2011 and his particular role is researching the impact of welfare reform on our poorest communities and the emergence of food banks as a response to food poverty. And our second speaker is Caroline, who I'll leave Davey to introduce at the end of his short session. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much for inviting me here. Just to say, nothing about us without us is for us. That was a line taken from the American Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s. And the Poverty Truth Commission, that's our strapline. I'm denoted as an expert witness here, but I actually think my colleague Caroline is considerably more expert in that she lives with poverty. One of the things I've been looking at with the Poverty Truth Commission as a volunteer is the emergence of food banks as a response to it. And obviously in the UK, across the UK, this isn't just Scotland, we've seen a tripling in the number of food banks run by the Trussell Trust, which is one of the big main providers of food banks. And, you know, a huge number of those people using the food banks are in work. So again, one of the myths that I'm sure you guys will be exploring over the next couple of days is that work is the answer to everything. It's not. Paid employment is not the answer to poverty necessarily or by any means. Many people in work are using food banks. Many people, increasing numbers of people are being sanctioned by the DWP, which will mean you're losing your benefits maybe for a month in the first instance, maybe for 3 months after that. And that can be for failing to sign something that you were meant to sign, you've made a mistake, or you were 5 minutes late to sign on. So there's a vicious regime of sanctions imposition on people who are already in poverty at this time. And that actually is one of the drivers. It's by no means the only driver. It's a minority driver at the moment, but it's an increasing number of people who are being driven to food banks by the imposition of sanctions. Now, food banks are staffed by well-meaning people who give of their time, and it's not my job to diss food banks or to say that they are totally inadequate. But I simply agree with Niall Cooper, who's the Chief Executive of Church Action and Poverty, when he said food banks are not designed to and should not replace the normal safety net provided by the state in the form of welfare support. And certainly a big concern of mine is that there is evidence, pretty anecdotal at the moment, not really hard evidence, but there is evidence that people in government agencies are saying to people, when, for example, they sanction you, well, you can always go to the food bank to get food, because basically if you're sanctioned, you have no money. So there is some evidence developing that the food bank is beginning to be seen as part of the social security system. And obviously, in the previous speaker's own organisation, Oxfam have pointed to the cuts to social security nets have gone too far, leading to destitution, hardship and hunger on a large scale. So, I mean, we've heard a lot already about hunger in Britain. It's increasing and it's been pushed further by the benefit cuts. They're called welfare reform. I would say they're benefit cuts because, for example, people with disability are being impacted by 20% cuts in the overall budget for disability with the introduction of personal independence payments. The tranche of money put aside for that as a replacement for disability living allowances is 20% less than it was before. So there's a driver, one of the big drivers to increased use of food banks is obviously the benefit cuts. Alongside that is the imposition of sanctions. So how do we respond to that? And obviously you'll be giving a lot of thought to wider topics than that, but also to that topic in the next couple of days. There's been an attempt by CAP and Oxfam asking the Select Committee, Work and Pensions, to really investigate the growth in food poverty and its relationship to welfare reform and the benefit cuts. And my understanding is that investigation has not been undertaken as of yet, if it will ever be undertaken. And certainly Lord Freud, who's the Minister in the Work and Pensions Department, he denies any link between welfare reform and the increasing use of food banks. He says, well, it's free food. So if it's free food, you'll get an increasing demand for food bank provision. So the government denies that there's a link there. They also say that there's a very small proportion of overall numbers that are referrals from job centres to food banks. Now, I don't know the numbers, we don't have hard evidence on it, but certainly, anecdotally, it's going to be an increasing proportion. Because if we look at, by 2020, it's predicted that there'll be something like 50,000 more children in food poverty by 2020, and I know that part of your task and your teams is to jump 10 years hence from 2020 to 2024. Well, Save the Children are certainly indicating if we continue with the way we're going, there'll be 50,000 more children living in poverty by 2020. At this point, we've got 61% of parents in poverty have to cut back on food bills, and 29% are able to buy less fresh fruit and vegetables because it's too expensive. 80% of parents in poverty have had to borrow money to pay for essentials, such as food and clothes, in the past year. That was in 2012. So what's the Poverty Truth Commission doing about it? Well, the Poverty Truth Commission looks at various areas. We've got people in government in our commission, we've got politicians. Most importantly, we've got people in poverty who are commissioners. And we bring people together to say that there'll be no solution to poverty found if you don't actually, it's not just consult with people in poverty, but if you don't actually have people in poverty at the heart of decision making. So, for example, we've got a mutual mentoring scheme with the Scottish Government whereby fairly senior civil servants and people who live in poverty have swapped, have gone to each other's places of living and working. So we had civil servants over in Glasgow, and we had some of our commissioners kind of shadowing civil servants at St Andrew's House. So that's one of the things we do. We're looking at 4 main areas at the moment, which is in-work poverty, which is reducing stigma, is the impact of welfare reforms, and the costs of being poor. You know, if you're poor, it's not really possible to set up a direct debit, or it's much harder to set up a direct debit. You have meters, you have cards for your meter, and that's much more expensive than if you're more comfortably off and you've got direct debits set up. There are big costs involved. There's what they call a poverty premium involved in being poor in terms of how you pay for your fuel, transport, etc. I don't think I want to say too much more, other than to say that if poor people are put at the heart of solutions, then quite often we begin to see things that work with the grain of where poor people's lives are. For example, one of the things the Poverty Truth Commission has supported, but actually came from people living at the sharp end, was the idea of budgeting groups as a response, rather than food banks as a response, but budgeting groups, peer-to-peer budgeting groups as a response to welfare reform. Not because those budgeting groups can halt welfare reform or can halt the budget cuts. We're not seeing them as some utopian solution, but they were a solution that came from grassroots communities and Gorbals about mind over money, how we can get groups of people who are struggling with poverty together to look at stigma, not to just look at, because lots of people can budget far better than me, but to look at how you resist pester power, brand power, how you look at those issues that inculcate feelings of inferiority and lower self-esteem because your kid doesn't have the same brand clothes as other kids have got. So it doesn't need Jamie Oliver to tell people, you know, how to look at these issues. People in poverty are perfectly capable of looking at these issues and about the things that are spent on. They simply don't have the choices to buy a lot of the healthier foods that Caroline are well aware of.
Thanks very much to all our witnesses this morning. I think, that comment about Jamie, the other thing he said on Women's Hour, Caroline, was, well, this programme and this new book is not for people who have absolutely no money at all. And the question Jane Garvey didn't ask him is, what is there for those people? Which I guess would have taken us into richer territory. Okay, we've got a few moments before we break for coffee. So I think we've got a little bit of space to ask some of our speakers any questions. Yeah, one or two questions. So we don't have. Are we not mic'd at the desks? Are we? So is that
this will work? I think
they are working fine. Okay. So anybody got any questions for any of our speakers?
Could I ask something, please?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you. My name's Robin Hill. I'm a local minister in East Lothian, and I am one of the trustees of East Lothian Food Bank. I'd just like to say a big thank you to our speakers today for saying what you have said about food poverty, and in particular about the really ambiguous role of a great number of food banks around the country. One thing I'd like to stress is that when Fiona O'Donnell, our Member of Parliament for East Lothian, and myself started up the food bank about a year ago in this constituency, we made it absolutely clear to our potential supporters and to the community at large that what we were doing was not just providing some sort of base for offering food to people that need it, but that we were absolutely dead keen to ensure that we had a strong policy role, a campaigning role. And I would really want to make clear that there are a number of food banks around the country that are much, much more than providers of food. What we're going to be doing is working with the Poverty Truth Commission, Martin Johnson, of the Poverty Truth Commission in the months to come, and working with the Church of Scotland, Church and Society Council, to ensure that we have an opportunity for people around the country, and in particular in East Lothian, to be telling their stories, offering us the stories that they have, so that we can collate them and find a way of getting those stories to the policy makers, whether in Holyrood or in Westminster. We have an MP who is absolutely passionate about this, and I am as well. So I just wondered if David can maybe just say a few words about the notion of food banks operating as policy changers.
It's a very fair point to make that there are different models of, can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
There are different models of food bank, and certainly there are models in Glasgow that I would support because they're much more all-embracing. For example, there's one in Annie's Land where people are referred for debt advice, people can be referred to relevant agencies. It's much more than about simply giving food, as our speaker over there said. So, as I said in my remarks, I don't want to diss food banks as such. They can certainly be a complement to other modes of support for people. And certainly in terms of a campaigning role for food banks, certainly I know, to be fair, that the Trussell Trust have been talking to the government about the increasing evidence of people using food banks as a result of benefits and other changes. So in a sense, they've got involved in an advocacy role there. So certainly, I did a bit of mapping of food banks in Glasgow. And by food banks, I mean everything from the lowliest burger, the lowliest van and dry food store to an organised food bank in the classic style. So I'm meaning a wide range of kind of provision of different models of giving. And some are very clear that the food bank offering is an emergency provision for 3 days, and that you won't get more than 3 vouchers in a certain amount of time, because you could argue that's more honest. It's saying this is an emergency provision, we're not a solution. But I'm also aware of other food banks who, as the speaker on my left was saying, who are offering a much more holistic model of provision. All I would say is, in terms of what the Poverty Truth Commission is trying to do in terms of is, for example, there was a more prosperous church in Glasgow that's twinned with a church in a priority area, and they're looking at some of the vacant ground at the back of the church with a view to helping to maybe getting something like the Denison Diggers going in terms of getting local food production going and people growing their own food. So that's something they're beginning to look at instead of a food bank. But they haven't come to firm conclusions. They might do both. But that's one of the things they're looking at. I guess what in the Poverty Truth Commission is we don't want to rule anything out, but we do want to see initiatives that spring from people in poverty themselves. That's where we want to get the bulk of our ideas from, because quite often they'll be the ones that are best tailored to local circumstances. And certainly we're very supportive of any campaigning that others might undertake directly on issues of benefit cuts and the impact that's had in driving people to food banks. The reality is there'll be some people who wouldn't use food banks if they were down, as they often are, down at the last penny. They just wouldn't use them because of the stigma. And that's one of the groups that we have looking at in the Poverty Truth Commission, is reducing stigma. We've a big job to do.
Thank you very much. Some of you may know this, but not many, but I started my career in the civil service and I worked for 3 years in what was then the DHSS. And we knew back in 1977, 1978 that people didn't take up all their cash benefits they were entitled to because of stigma. So it's a little surprise that people feel the same way about what are called food handouts, when actually what it is an absolutely essential part of just being alive. So thank you very much to our speakers this morning. Oh, Katherine.
Yeah, can I just respond a bit more about the role of food banks in campaigning? I mean, with all due respect to all the amazing people who volunteer their time and energy at food banks, my goodness, I wish we didn't have them. We're the 7th richest country in the world, and people are at the point of starvation. They're going and asking for food, and I used to work in a soup kitchen, and you have to be at rock bottom to ask for food. But all that said, what food banks do enable is for the members of the general public to get their head around what is happening to our social security system, because there are so many changes that are going on simultaneously. It's incredibly complicated, but people can understand a queue outside a food bank. And so what we've been able to do, we support the Trussell Trust, we support other independent food banks as well, like the one I mentioned out at Clydebank. Through that work, we've published the report Walking the Breadline with Church Action on Poverty, alongside that report, and through Oxfam's supporter network, we got people to write to their MPs demanding that the Department of Work and Pensions Select Committee, as David talked about, hold an inquiry into the link between changes in the benefit system and food bank rise and people presenting at food banks. I had the committee chair on the phone to me by 11 o'clock that morning, that the day the report was released, saying we are being inundated. And while we're still plugging away, what that did enable us was to have, we had one of the Liberal Democrat peers ask a question in the Lords a couple of weeks later. That was the one that David Freud's infamous answer was that people are just going to food banks because it's free food, and so that kicked off a whole other spate of publicity and so on. So while I really wish we didn't have them, what they do enable us to do is to tell a story about the reality of poverty, and people can understand what's going on when the complexity and the surreptitiousness of a lot of these changes in the welfare system are going on in the background. The picture of food banks is the canary in the mine that we can talk to.
Okay, yeah, one more, Antonia.
I was just going to follow on from that, because I live in the Dundee area, and there was an interesting article in the Courier this week which was pointing out the increase in stealing, which it very clearly said is a result of poverty, and I wonder whether that's another canary in the mine. And it was interestingly saying that the number of women who were stealing, and that they were not repeat offenders, they were stealing because they were absolutely in need of that food. And I just wondered if Oxfam was looking at that.
Not directly, but it's stories we're hearing throughout the communities. I mean, it's a most stark false economy. I mean, that Ian Duncan Smith tells us that the objective of these changes is to shrink the welfare budget, but what he's doing is squeezing one part of the balloon and it's expanding elsewhere. Yesterday I was talking to a social worker who works in Tower Hamlets in London, and she said that more and more people are being presented at hospital, and the analysis is from the social work department is it's directly because of the stress inflicted by the benefit changes. Now, that's probably one of the, and she was saying she used to work in a prison, she said that's more expensive than prison. And so if we're trying to save money, I mean, even for the sake, put aside the argument that of course we can afford to have a country where everyone can live within dignity. You know, if we're trying to save money, we're going about it the wrong way, because we're squeezing the balloon here and it's exploding elsewhere in the health system, in the criminal justice system, in debt advice agencies, and on the other hand, we're closing down those advice centres.
that are so important. So it's a perverse way of governing the country.
Thank you very much. I need to wind up, Pete, because otherwise people won't get their coffee. We're moving to tea and coffee now, and that we're then moving from the tea and coffee session into our team sessions at 10 to 11. Okay, right, okay. If you don't know what team you're in, then make yourself known to Pete or Claire, blank there, and they can assign you to one. The names of the team sessions are on the doors. They're all along the corridor to the left as you come out of here, so straight ahead of you when you're having your tea and coffee. One final thing, all of our witnesses today who can stay for the ongoing sessions, including Rochelle, who's over there in the yellow jacket, are available for people to ask questions, talk to, test ideas and so forth throughout the sessions. So it's designed to be something where we have that interaction. So thank you very much for listening this morning. Thank you so much to our speakers, because I found that just really, really interesting takes and really rich ideas to take into your sessions. Enjoy your tea and coffee, and then along to the team sessions. We'll hurry you along and keep you track of time. See you later.